Let's think now about designing and conducting new research. So the steps in evidence-based practice, the 6 A's, suggest that we can be involved in this ongoing process of assessing a situation, asking an empirical question, acquiring relevant information, appraising the quality of that information, and deciding whether it applies to our situation, and if so, what we're going to do about it, auditing or evaluating the results, and moving on to new questions. We've talked a lot about this process in the course, focused on using existing information, critically appraising research and seeing what we think of it. But it's also possible to think about this as a sort of novel, creative research process, where we're asking questions and acquiring information directly from clients or professionals, people who have data that we're interested in understanding, and then analyzing the data ourselves, seeing how it applies to various situations. So when relevant information is not available, there are several other things we can do. Following our library and gray literature searches, you may not find what you're looking for. Gaps in existing knowledge could be due to a lack of research in the area, or concerns that we have about qualities of available studies. For example, studies may have poor construct validity or have threats to internal validity that make us concerned about their integrity. We may have concerns about the applicability of available studies to our context. So consider ways in which we can generate new knowledge, perhaps in collaboration with researchers and practitioners and others. We can do this by suggesting topics that other people ought to take on for studies, and we can become engaged in research ourselves. So here's a quick outline of steps in the research process, probably very familiar to you at this point. I'd like to touch on each of these topics a little bit. The problem formulation stage is first, and it's at this point we think about the purpose of the study. Is this primarily for exploratory purposes? Do we want to describe a set of people or services, phenomenon? Or is our purpose explanatory? Are we trying to explain associations or causes? Are we generating or testing hypotheses? What is the purpose of the study? And then, what is the central question or hypothesis? And importantly, is it an empirical question? We've talked before about how to frame empirical questions. And at this point, we want to think about whether the topic can be explicated and refined using the PICOS structure or a variation on PICOS. And we need to think about what kinds of trade-offs we might want to make or have to make. And here I'm thinking about, given the aims of the study, how important is construct validity, just getting the constructs right? How important is internal validity, and how important is external validity? At this stage, we may need to rank them because we probably can't have it all, and we're going to have to set some priorities. Then we'll think about an overall study design. What do we need to know? And again, the answer to that question depends on the kinds of inferences we want to make. You've seen this before in different iterations. So depending on what we want to know, we will think about what kinds of logic and evidence will be required to provide useful information on that topic. So sampling is the next stage. And here the basic question is, who can provide the information that you want? What's the target population? And we try to identify that target population as clearly as possible. And then the question is, what kind of sample will you use? What sampling strategies make sense? Will you be using probability or non-probability sampling methods? And once you've made that decision, within those categories, what kinds of sampling methods will you use? Will you use any stratifying variables, for example? Early on, you do need to think about ethical issues and informed consent. So it's important to check with agency or institutional guidelines on research and obtain necessary approval or permission before you start a study. At a minimum, you will need an introductory letter or a statement to potential participants that explains who you are, the purpose of the research, sources of funding, expectations of participants, and their ethical rights, their rights to voluntary participation, confidentiality or anonymity, etc. So here you see our lecture on research ethics for more discussion of those topics. Then you want to think about how you're going to collect data, and there are lots of options here. You might want to see if you can use existing measures. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of instruments out there for measuring different, all kinds of aspects of human behavior, development, communication, interaction. So it's very wise to take a look at existing measures. Librarians can be enormously helpful in leading you to good sources of this information. There are a couple of online websites that are useful. Burroughs has a mental measurements yearbook. Every, I think, 3 years they come up with a new compendium of existing instruments that are being used in psychology and education to measure all kinds of things about human beings. There's a wonderful set of books called Measures for Clinical Practice and Research by Joel Fisher and Kevin Corcoran. 2-volume set, one on measures for adults, another on measures for couples, families, and children. A lot of these instruments are short, they're well developed, and frequently used in clinical practice. And there's also a measurement instrument database for the social sciences website that is another collection of measures. So take a look at what's in these sources, and you can search for constructs that are important to you. You'll also find in these places information on the reliability and validity testing that's been done on various instruments. You may find that you'll need to adapt existing measures because they were developed in a population very different from yours. And if you do that, once you begin to change words or the structure of an instrument, just know that you're no longer working with an established measure. And that's okay. That may be what you need to do to make it work in your setting. And then the third option is to create your own measures. And here's some ideas about doing that. When you're creating a new measure, let's say it's a survey instrument or an interview guide, you don't start by writing questions. That can get out of hand pretty quickly. Start with a list of information needs. What is it that you want to know in terms of topics? And then write questions to address those needs. So it's important to make sure that each question is necessary and crystal clear. We want to avoid leading questions, questions that suggest the answer. We want to avoid double-barreled questions, questions that really are 2 or 3 questions in one. And then as you're doing this, think about the order in which questions are asked. We want to have a logical flow that makes sense to people we're talking to or surveying. So we might want to organize questions in terms of topics. Think also about the burden, data collection burden on participants. How long is this going to take? Are they going to get tired? Are they going to want to quit at a certain point? And then it's very important to pilot test questions. Try them out on your friends or coworkers before you try them out on a sample. Okay, you need to make some choices about whether to ask open or closed-ended questions, or maybe both. So open-ended questions, as you know, encourage detailed, elaborated responses, and that's often very useful to get people's sort of in-depth, thoughtful take on a set of issues. But open-ended questions yield narrative data that can be cumbersome to analyze. Closed-ended questions have a fixed range of possible answers, so it's a different approach. They may be a little bit easier to analyze, but sometimes it's difficult to get that fixed range of answers right. So whatever you do, don't reinvent the wheel here. It's really important to see how others have asked similar questions. And here's a really good book that's a resource on that, on asking questions. Bradburn, Sudman, and Wansink. So we often think about whether to conduct interviews in a standardized or unstandardized manner. A standardized interview sort of reduces variation in the order and wording of questions. So it's really a script, a clear script that includes instructions. And the idea is that we're going to follow the wording of questions exactly, and there will be response categories that we ask people to use. This provides more comparable data across participants, facilitates coding and analysis of responses, but it is scripted, so it's not a natural conversation. Unstandardized interviews will use interview guides, which are really a list of topics or questions that can be asked in any order, so we can skip around. This facilitates more natural conversations and gathering of data on diverse topics, but it can be more difficult to keep track of where you are in an interview, which questions you haven't asked, and where to go next. So then, how to collect the data? There are many options here, and here are some modes of data collection. These approaches to data collection are nicely described in this book, Applied Social Research Methods by Bickman and Rogge. They talk in depth about how to use in-person interviews, to build rapport. We sometimes use what are called show cards. They're index cards that have response categories on them to remind people of the structure of responses that we're using. Telephone interviews are another option, but response rates are declining over time because we're all inundated with telephone interviewing, especially from marketing firms and polling groups. Mail surveys are another option, but response rates tend to be very low. And we're doing a lot more with internet and computerized surveys. So these can be web-based surveys, they can be surveys that are available on any kind of electronic device. They can be structured, so there's a fixed order to questions or not. People can skip around, and you can include both closed and open-ended questions. There are issues, though, around security of data collected online, so we do have to be very careful about that. And then, of course, there's the good old-fashioned self-administered paper and pencil approach that still works. So for data analysis, there are lots of options. There are a number of different programs for qualitative analysis software, and these are programs that help us analyze text and observations. So we do a contents analysis, coding of content, and identification of themes. Lots of flexible computer programs for that. And I would also highly recommend the book by Deborah Paget, Qualitative Methods in Social Work Research, just to get an overview of this kind of work. For quantitative analysis, it's very straightforward to do descriptive data on a sample, and the kinds of bivariate and multivariate analyses that we've been talking about in class. You'll get some experience with this in RIP2. But again, lots of software support for analysis and a lot of visual aids are available. In terms of reporting results, it's important to think about who your audience is, who will use the information that you've collected and for what purposes. Guidelines for reporting the results of empirical research are available at equatornetwork.com. You've seen this graphic before, guide to decision making about which guidelines you should follow. And there are also guidelines for publication available in a number of places. That's it for now.